The Last Post, Part 1. The Man Who Stopped Moving. The frost came early to Vermont that year. It crept in before October had finished settling over the hills like something that had been waiting patient, inevitable, indifferent to whatever plans the living had made. By the time November arrived, the trees along Route 9 had gone bare, their branches reaching up into a gray sky the color of old concrete, and the small towns tucked between the mountains had pulled inward the way small towns always do when the cold comes. Lights appeared earlier in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. People moved from warmth to warmth, stepping through the cold as quickly as they could, as though the air itself was something to be endured rather than breathed. At the far edge of a gravel pull-off just outside the town limits of Millhaven, population 1,847, according to a green highway sign that had been losing letters since the previous spring, a dark blue Ford F250 sat with its engine off. It had been sitting there since before the sun came up. The windows had fogged from the inside. A thin skin of frost covered the hood. Inside, a man was asleep in the driver's seat, or something close to asleep. His eyes were closed, but his jaw was tight, and his right hand rested on the door handle, the way a man holds a door handle when he is ready to move at any moment, even in sleep, even in whatever passed for sleep now. His name was Garrett Mercer. He was 36 years old. He did not look it. He looked like a man who had spent those 36 years more fully than most people spend 60, like someone had taken a life and compressed it, squeezed out whatever softness might have existed early on, and left behind something lean and hard and very, very tired. In the passenger seat, a German shepherd named Atlas breathed slowly, his broad chest rising and falling, with the calm of a Tao who had learned long ago that stillness was not weakness. His coat was dark at the back and lighter at the chest, and there were flecks of gray now around his muzzle that had not been there 2 years ago. He was 8 years old, for a working dog that was old enough to feel. When he shifted position in the seat, you could see the slight hesitation in his back left leg there, and gone like a word almost said and then swallowed. On the dashboard, held in place by the edge of the defroster vent, was a single sheet of paper. It was a letter. Specifically, it was a rejection letter printed on the letterhead of a private security firm based out of Burlington. The language was professional and courteous and utterly meaningless. "We appreciate your service. We will keep your application on file. We wish you the best in your search." It was the 9th letter like it in 4 months. Garrett opened his eyes. He did not move right away. He had learned years ago in places where moving too quickly could mean not moving again to open his eyes first and take stock before he did anything else. A habit so deep it had become reflex. He looked at the windshield, at the frost-gray light coming through it, at the trees visible through the film of condensation. He looked at Atlas, who was already looking at him with the specific calm attention that Atlas reserved for the moment Garrett woke up, as if the dog had been keeping watch and was now delivering his report. "Nothing to report. We're still here." Garrett reached across and laid his hand on the dog's back. Atlas exhaled slowly through his nose. He had been back 14 months. 14 months since the unit had stood down. 14 months since he had shaken the hands of the men he had lived inside of danger with, since he had climbed into the transport that would take him toward the life he was supposed to want now. 14 months of motels and pull-offs and rejection letters, and a silence that was not peaceful, not the silence between soldiers who understood each other, but a different kind. The silence of a man standing in a room where no one knew him and no one needed to. He was not broken. He needed to be clear about that, even if only to himself. He had seen broken. He knew what it looked like, what it sounded like at 3 in the morning in a bunk room with thin walls. He was not that, but he was something he did not have a word for yet. He was a Navy SEAL who no longer had a mission. And for a man built entirely around purpose, that was its own kind of damage. He had been recruited at 22 the year after he graduated from a state university in Pennsylvania with a degree in kinesiology that he had never once thought about using. He had enlisted not because he had no other options, He had options, but because something in him had always moved toward difficulty the way water moves toward low ground, naturally, without resistance. He had tested for the SEAL program, not because anyone told him to, but because when he learned it existed, he could not think of a single good reason not to try. He passed. He had spent the next 12 years becoming someone he was not sure he could explain to people who had not lived it. 4 deployments, 3 different theaters of operation, assignments he could not describe at dinner tables in the few attempts he had made at dinner tables. He had been in places that had no names in the news. He had done things that were necessary and legal and deeply fundamentally human in their horror and their purpose. He had held positions under fire until relief arrived. He had carried men out of buildings that no one should have been in. He had made decisions at 2 in the morning in absolute darkness that he would carry for the rest of his life, not because they were wrong, but because they were final, and finality has weight. And through all of it, Atlas had come to him in year 4, a working dog assigned to his unit trained in tracking and detection and the particular form of loyalty that some animals seem to understand better than people do. The dog had been introduced to Garrett the way tools are introduced functionally with a briefing on capability and protocol. But within a week, something else had happened, something that did not have a place in the briefing documents. Atlas had found Garrett, not in the sense of physical location, though he did that too with a precision that still seemed impossible when Garrett thought about it. He found him in the other way. The way dogs sometimes do, choosing a person with the same quiet certainty. A person might choose a direction, and then simply going that way, no argument, no negotiation. In year 7, a building collapsed. The sequence of events that led to it had moved too fast for any one person to have stopped, and the sound of it, the deep concussive groan of a structure giving up, was something Garrett still heard in the space between one thought and the next. He had been inside. Atlas had been outside. In the 9 minutes it took the dust to settle enough to see, Atlas had moved through 3 different entry points until he found the one that led to Garrett, and then he had pulled. Not barked, not waited. Pulled with everything he had at the sleeve of Garrett's jacket until the two of them were outside in the heat and the noise, and Garrett was on his knees in the dirt counting his own breaths. He had never properly thanked the dog. He had never figured out how. Atlas shifted in the passenger seat and made a low sound, not distress, just something between a sigh and a statement. He looked toward the window, then back at Garrett, then toward the window again. Garrett understood. He pushed open the truck door, and the cold came in immediately, the kind of cold that skips negotiation and goes directly to bone. He walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, and Atlas climbed down slowly, that slight hesitation again, in the back left leg there, and gone like something he was trying not to show. They walked the edge of the pull-off together, the gravel pale with frost under their feet, their breath making small clouds in the air. The trees stood quiet. A crow moved somewhere in the branches, invisible at sound, hanging in the cold like punctuation. Garrett stood with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and looked at nothing in particular. 4 months since he had officially stopped moving and tried to begin whatever this phase was supposed to be. 4 months since the last conversation with his ex-wife, Laura, who had tried hard and deserved someone capable of being present in the way marriage requires, which Garrett had not been, and both of them had finally admitted it with more grace than they had expected. No anger. Just the quiet acknowledgement of 2 adults recognizing that some distances are not about geography. 4 months since the last time he had spoken to anyone for more than 15 minutes. The rejection letters had a logic to them that he understood. Security firms wanted men with certain profiles, and while his record was exactly right, something about in-person interviews revealed something that did not fit what they were looking for. He was not sure what it was. He suspected it was the thing he could not turn off, the quality of attention that had kept him alive in bad places but seemed to unsettle people across a desk in a conference room. The way he went still instead of performing ease. The way his eyes moved. He looked at Atlas, who had stopped walking and was standing with his nose raised to the air, reading something Garrett could not access. He thought about the letter on the dashboard. He thought about his bank account, which had enough in it for perhaps 2 more months of motels and fuel, and the particular food Atlas needed for a dog his age with his joint issues. He thought about the fact that he had driven to Vermont for no reason that he could articulate, just a direction that had seemed as reasonable as any other. He thought as he did sometimes and always pushed away about the last mission, about the moment everything changed, about Donovan Calloway. He pushed it away. Atlas looked at him, then began walking toward the road. They drove into Millhaven as the morning light was becoming something actual, thin and pale but present, filling the valley between the hills with a kind of winter gold that made everything look briefly like a painting of itself. The town was small in the way that Vermont towns are small, not emptied out, but concentrated, the houses close to the road, the church white against the dark trees, the one main street short enough to walk end to end in 5 minutes, but dense with the specific character of a place that knows what it is. Most things were not yet open. A hardware store with its lights on, a pharmacy, a gas station where a man in a heavy coat was filling a pickup truck and looking at the sky the way people in cold places look at the sky, assessing, not admiring. At the far end of the main street, set back slightly from the road behind a parking lot with 8 painted spaces and a single maple tree, whose bare branches scraped the edge of the roof, was a diner. The sign above the door read, Calloway's. The letters were painted in red against white, and the paint had held up better than the frame around the sign, which had weathered to a soft gray. In the window, the word open glowed orange in the way of those old illuminated signs that no one makes anymore. And in the window beside it, through glass that needed cleaning, the yellow light of the interior was visible, warm and specific and oddly deliberate against the cold morning. Garrett pulled in and sat for a moment with the engine off. Atlas was already looking at the door. Inside the diner was the kind of place that exists in the spaces between the places people think of when they think of America. Not famous, not discovered, not the subject of any article or list or social media post. Just a room that had been doing the same thing for a long time, feeding people, keeping them warm, giving them a place to sit that was not their house and not the street. 8 booths along the left wall covered in vinyl the color of deep red that had faded toward rose at the edges. A counter running the length of the right side with 6 stools, 4 of which still had their original upholstery. A kitchen visible through the service window, clean and functional in the way of a kitchen where someone takes pride not in appearance but in the work itself. Photographs on the walls, not decorative, not curated, just accumulated. Local sports teams from decades past. A framed newspaper front page about a flood in 1987. A photograph of 2 people standing in front of the diner in what might have been 1966, squinting into summer sun, their arms around each other. The man behind the counter was 78 years old. He was not small, but age had compressed him slightly, the way time compresses everything, so that the man he had been at 50 was still visible in his frame, but seemed to have settled, become more concentrated. His hair was white and cut short. His hands were the hands of a man who had been doing physical work since before Garrett was born, large-knuckled with a particular permanence of hands that have shaped things and fixed things and held things together over a long span of time. His name was Emmett Calloway. He had opened this diner in 1964, the year he turned 18, with his wife Eleanor, and $4,000 they had saved and borrowed and worried over until the savings became something real. Eleanor had been gone for 8 years. The diner remained. Emmett looked up when the door opened. He looked at the man who walked in lean, quiet eyes that moved in the particular way of people trained to assess a space before they enter it fully. And then he looked at the dog. The dog walked at the man's left side close, but not pressed, and it moved through the diner the way working dogs move through unfamiliar spaces, alert, controlled, taking note of everything without reacting to any of it. Its bearing was unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Emmett had seen that bearing before, in photographs, in the careful, economic way his son had described the dogs in his letters home. Donovan had written once about a dog named, but here Emmett stopped himself because the man was approaching the counter, and the thought moving through him was one he had learned to handle carefully like a tool with an edge. He reached under the counter for a bowl, filled it with water from the tap, and set it at the end of the counter without comment. Garrett looked at the bowl, then at the old man. "He can sit by the booth if that's easier," Garrett said. "Counter's fine," Emmett said. "What can I get you?" "Coffee." "Food," Garrett looked at the menu board above the counter. He could not remember when he had last eaten anything that required a menu. "Eggs. Whatever's easiest." Emmett nodded and moved to the kitchen without further discussion. The ease of it, the absence of small talk, the lack of any requirement that Garrett perform normalcy settled over him like something he had not known he was missing. He sat at the counter. Atlas drank from the bowl and then lay down nearby his head, up watching the room. The eggs came. They were good, simple, and properly made, the kind of food that announces itself through quality of attention rather than complexity. Garrett ate slowly. The coffee was strong and real. Outside, through the window, the morning light had fully arrived, filling the parking lot with pale winter sun. Emmett moved behind the counter with the economy of a man in a familiar space, refilling the coffee without being asked, cleaning something that was already clean, doing the 10,000 small things that keep a place running that no one ever notices until they stop being done. No one else came in. At some point, Garrett could not have said exactly when Emmett stopped moving and stood at the far end of the counter with his own cup of coffee and looked at Atlas. "Working dog," he said. It was not a question. "Was," Garrett said. Emmett nodded slowly. "Military." Yes, another silence. Not uncomfortable. More like the silence between two people who have both learned that silence is not a problem to be solved. "You just passing through?" Emmett asked. Garrett considered the question honestly. "I don't know." Emmett looked at him for a moment. Then he refilled Garrett's coffee and went back to his work. They talked for 3 hours. It did not feel like 3 hours. It felt like something outside of time. The specific quality of conversation that happens rarely, that cannot be engineered, that requires both people to have arrived at a place where pretense is simply too much effort. Garrett was not a man who talked easily. He had never been, and 12 years of operating in environments where unnecessary communication was a liability had deepened that tendency into something close to architecture. He did not fill silences. He did not offer information that was not asked for. But Emmett asked the right things, or rather, he asked the few things and left enormous space around them so that Garrett could choose what to put in that space and what to leave out. They talked about the road, about how long Garrett had been moving about Vermont in winter, about Atlas, and the particular quality of a working dog's loyalty, which Emmett said he thought people misunderstood. "People think it's obedience," Emmett said. "It's not obedience, it's choice. The dog chooses you every morning." They talked about the diner, about 1964, about Eleanor, about the highway that had redirected traffic and slowly over years changed the mathematics of the place, about how the booths had once been full every morning and the counter had a waiting list on weekends, about how that had changed and then changed again until now it was mostly regulars, a handful of them, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a place when most of its original reason for existing has moved somewhere else, but the place itself has not. They talked around the edges of the thing Emmett had not yet said and the thing Garrett had not said to anyone since he left. At some point, Emmett refilled his own coffee for the third time and stood at the counter and said, "I had a son, Donovan. He was in the army." He paused. "Afghanistan." Garrett looked up from his cup. "He was good at it," Emmett said. "Same way some people are good at music, like it was what he was designed for." He looked at the window. "I was angry about that for a long time, that he chose it. Then I wasn't angry anymore. Then he stopped, set down his cup, picked it up again. He didn't come home 3 years ago." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the main street, slowing at the crosswalk, then continuing. I'm sorry, Garrett said. It was the right thing to say and the inadequate thing to say, and both of them knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Emmett nodded once. You been in? Emmett asked. Navy, Garrett said. 12 years. Emmett looked at him. Something moved in his expression, a calculation, a recognition, but he did not say what it was. He just nodded again and moved to the kitchen to start on lunch prep that would feed at most 6 people. He had recognized Garrett. He had understood in the first 30 seconds of looking at the man and the dog that this was someone from Donovan's world. The bearing was too specific, the dog too precisely trained to be anything other than military. And when Garrett mentioned 12 years in the Navy, something solidified in Emmett that had been forming since the man walked through the door. But Emmett Calloway had learned patience the same way he had learned everything else worth knowing through loss. And he understood with the clarity of a man who had spent 78 years watching people that this particular man needed to come back on his own terms before anything real could pass between them. If he showed the photograph now, before Garrett had chosen to return, it would feel like a trap, like manipulation dressed as generosity. And the man in front of him had clearly had enough of situations he had not chosen to be in. So Emmett put the cup down and went back to the kitchen and decided to wait. He would know when the time was right. Garrett came back the next morning. He had not planned to. He had pulled back onto Route 9 the previous afternoon and driven 4 miles north before he stopped the truck at another pull-off and sat for 20 minutes and then, without making what felt like a decision, turned around. He told himself it was because of Atlas. Atlas needed consistency. Routine helped a dog with joint problems. The diner had a good bowl. He sat at the same stool. Emmett brought coffee without being asked. Atlas lay at the end of the counter. On the third morning, without anyone suggesting it, Garrett noticed that the light fixture above the corner booth had a bulb out. He found a replacement in the supply closet. He had noticed the supply closet on the first morning, assessed it without thinking, filed it, and changed the bulb. Emmett watched him do it and said nothing. On the fifth morning, he fixed one of the stools that had developed a wobble. On the seventh, he reseated a section of counter trim that had begun to lift. He did not ask permission. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply moved through the space with the attention of someone who had spent a career identifying what needed to be addressed and then addressing it, and the diner began incrementally to tighten. Emmett let it happen. He did not thank Garrett, not directly, but one morning he put a plate of food on the counter before Garrett sat down, and when Garrett reached for his wallet, Emmett shook his head once and went back to the kitchen. That was the whole exchange. On the 18th morning, the snow came. It arrived overnight and covered everything with the specific silence of a heavy snowfall, not the hush of it falling, but the hush of the world after muffled and reorganized all the sharp edges of things gone soft. Garrett had been parked at the pull-off again. He had begun to think about finding a longer-term arrangement, a room somewhere, maybe a weekly rate, at one of the small inns north of town, but had not yet converted the thought into action. He drove to the diner through empty streets, the trucks terraforming compressing the new snow with a sound like slow breathing. The parking lot had not been plowed. He drove in, carefully parked, and sat for a moment. Then he found a shovel in the truck bed. He kept a shovel in the truck bed, along with a number of other things that a man who has spent his life preparing for contingencies tends to keep, and he cleared the parking lot. It took 40 minutes. When he went inside, stamping snow from his boots, Emmett was behind the counter and did not comment on the cleared lot, though Garrett saw him look at the window and see it. They drank coffee in companionable silence while the snow fell outside. My son rode home about a hui, Emmett said eventually. Not loudly, not as an announcement. Just something moving from the inside to the outside. Said it was the kind of dog that makes you believe the world has more sense in it than you thought. He looked at Atlas. Sounded like that one. Garrett looked at his coffee. He ever talk about the men he served with? Garrett asked. Some. Emmett turned his cup in a slow circle on the counter. Said one of them, his team leader later on was the kind of man you would want next to you when things went wrong. He paused. Said that was the highest thing he could think to say about a person. The kitchen was very quiet. Garrett did not say anything else, but something shifted in the space between them. Something that had been leaning in one direction now leaned in another, and both of them felt it, and neither of them named it. It was 3 weeks after Garrett first walked through the door that Emmett placed the folded document on the counter. Garrett looked at it, a single sheet official printed on county registered paper. He recognized what it was before he picked it up. "You're serious," he said. "Dollar in my pocket," Emmett said. He set a single bill on the counter beside the document. "You sign this, we exchange, and the building and the business and everything in it belongs to you." "You're serious," Garrett said again, because it seemed necessary to say it twice. "I'm 78 years old," Emmett said. "I don't have time to say things I don't mean." He leaned on the counter. "I'm not well, Garrett. I've known for a while. I'm not telling you this to make you feel obligated. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're walking into." Garrett looked at the document. He thought about the rejection letters on the dashboard. He thought about Atlas's back leg. He thought about the fact that he had not slept inside a building in 4 months and had not once in all of that time walked into a room and felt what he felt when he walked into this one. "There's debt," Emmett said. "I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but you've handled harder things." Garrett looked at him. The old man looked back without flinching. There was no apology in his face, no manipulation, just the calm certainty of someone who has made a decision after long deliberation and is done deliberating. He was not offering Garrett a building. He was offering him a reason to stop moving. Garrett picked up the pen. He signed the paper. Emmett took the dollar from his pocket, handed it across the counter, and nodded once. Then he poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward Garrett, and they drank in silence while Atlas watched the snow and the pale morning light came through the window and lay across the old red vinyl of the booth seats and the photographs on the wall and the worn surface of the counter that had been worn by 60 years of elbows and coffee cups and conversations and the quiet accumulation of days. Then Emmett set down his cup and reached below the counter. He placed a photograph on the counter and slid it toward Garrett. It was a 4x6 print, older, the color slightly muted with age. 2 men in military attire standing against a sand-colored wall at what was clearly a forward operating base. One of them was young, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing the expression of a man tolerating a camera for the sake of someone he cared about. The other man, slightly shorter, standing at the younger man's right shoulder, was squinting into afternoon light. Garrett looked at this photograph. He recognized both men. One was himself, younger by several years in a place he did not need to name. The other was Donovan Calloway, a man he had not seen a photograph of since the memorial service. A face he had been carrying inside him for 3 years in the specific weight-bearing way of someone who cannot put a thing down but is not yet ready to look at it directly. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at Emmett. "I recognized you when you walked through the door," Emmett said quietly. "Donovan sent this home in 2021, a few weeks before." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "I waited because I needed to be sure you would come back on your own. Not because of this." He touched the edge of the photograph. "If I had put this on the counter the first morning, you might have felt like you owed me something. And I didn't want that. I wanted you to be here because you chose to be." Garrett looked at the photograph again, at the version of himself captured in that afternoon light, at Donovan's face settled, purposeful, entirely himself. He did not say anything for a long time. "He saved my life," Garrett said. "I know," Emmett said, and then more quietly, "Thank you for being the kind of man worth saving." The snow was still falling outside. The light in the diner was warm in particular. Atlas lay at the end of the counter with his head up, watching the room with the attentiveness of a creature that has decided without drama or negotiation to be here. Garrett looked at the dollar bill in his hand. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the old man who had waited 3 weeks to say the most important thing he had to say, because he had understood that the timing of truth matters as much as the truth itself. He folded the dollar bill once carefully and put it in the front pocket of his jacket. He had no idea what he was doing. But for the first time in 14 months, he was not moving away from something. He was standing still. In stillness, he was beginning to remember is not the same as stopping. It is sometimes where everything begins. Part 2. The weight of what you carry. The first thing Garrett did was count what he had. Not in the way of a man taking inventory for comfort, not the reassuring kind of counting that people do when they need to feel less afraid. He did it the way he had done it before, every operation clinically without sentiment, with the specific purpose of knowing exactly where he stood before he decided what to do next. He sat in the truck in the diner's parking lot the morning after signing the paper and worked through the numbers on a yellow legal pad he kept in the glove compartment. Savings from 12 years of military service, modest and disciplined. Current monthly expenses, which were low because he had been living as though permanence was a liability. The balance against what he knew the diner would cost to make functional based on what he had observed in 3 weeks of quiet attention. The number at the bottom of the page was not good. It was not catastrophic, not immediately. But it left no room for error, no margin for the unexpected, and Garrett had spent enough of his life in conditions where the unexpected was the only reliable variable to understand that a plan with no margin is not a plan. It is a wish. He looked at the diner. The morning light was still thin, and in it, the building looked exactly what it was, a structure that had been built with care and then worn down by time and weather, and the slow indifference of a world that had reorganized itself around different roads. The sign above the door still said Callaway's. The parking lot still had its 8 painted spaces. The maple tree still stood at the corner of the lot, bare and patient, its roots doing whatever tree roots do, in frozen ground, persisting, probably the way things that go deep tend to persist regardless of what happens on the surface. He could walk away. The paperwork could be undone. He had not yet told anyone beyond Emmett. There was no one else to tell, and Emmett was not a man who would hold him to something that no longer made sense. He looked at Atlas in the passenger seat. Atlas looked at the diner. Garrett picked up the legal pad, folded it precisely in half, and put it in the glove compartment. Then he got out of the truck. He began with what he could reach. The kitchen first, because the kitchen was the engine of the thing, and an engine in poor condition makes everything else irrelevant. 2 of the 4 burners on the range were not firing reliably. The exhaust hood had a fan that ran, but vented incorrectly, which meant heat and grease particulate were recirculating rather than escaping. The commercial refrigerator was cold, but not cold enough, 3 degrees warmer than it should have been, which was the kind of thing that could be nothing or could become a problem, depending on what was stored and for how long. He worked through each issue methodically. The burners needed new igniter assemblies, which he sourced from a supply company in Burlington, and installed himself following a manual he found online at the library on a Tuesday afternoon. The hood vent had a damper that had seized from disuse. He freed it with penetrating oil and an hour of careful work. The refrigerator needed a new thermostat, which cost $47 and 20 minutes to replace. Then the plumbing. A section of pipe beneath the utility sink had developed a slow leak that had been addressed at some point in the past with a repair tape wrap that had held long enough for whoever applied it to feel satisfied, and then continued deteriorating quietly for what looked like another 2 years. He replaced the section. While he was in the walls, he found 2 other places where insulation had failed and cold air was finding its way into the building more directly than it should have been. He addressed those too. The roof had a section at the north end where the flashing had separated from the chimney. That was a half-day job in conditions that would have been miserable even for someone who minded the cold, which Garrett did not particularly. He worked up there in the gray November air with the kind of focused efficiency that comes from having done difficult physical work in much worse situations, And when he was done, the flashing was sealed and the seam was correct, and the interior of the building was warmer by a measurable degree. Atlas patrolled. That was the only word for it. While Garrett worked, Atlas moved through the diner with the unhurried thoroughness of a dog conducting a sweep, checking the corners, passing through the kitchen, returning to the front windows, circling the dining room. He had been trained for it, and the training did not go dormant simply because the context had changed. He was not looking for threats, or perhaps he was in his own way doing what working dogs do when the work is about protection, making sure the space was known, was mapped, was held in his understanding, so that anything that changed in it would register immediately. His back left leg was bothering him more than usual in the cold. Garrett could see it in the mornings, the extra half second before Atlas put weight on it, the slight compensation in how he distributed his mass when he stood. He did not show it in any obvious way. He did not limp. He simply worked around it with the quiet dignity of a creature that does not consider its own discomfort a reason to change course. Garrett watched this and said nothing and felt something he did not name. The days moved in a pattern that he had created and that now created him in return. 5 in the morning awake, coffee from a small percolator he had set up in the kitchen. A walk with Atlas through the parking lot and the block behind the diner while the town was still dark and the stars were still visible through the bare branches of the trees. Then work. He ate simply, usually at the counter in the late afternoon when the light was changing. He slept in the truck for the first 2 weeks, and then when the pipe situation on the west wall was fully resolved, he brought in a folding cot and set it up in the back storage room. And that became his room, which was fine. He had slept in worse rooms. He had slept in places that would make this room seem absurd to complain about. In the habit of comparison, the veteran's particular way of contextualizing comfort made him genuinely indifferent to the narrow space and the cold that gathered in it before the building's heating caught up each morning. Emmett came by twice a week. Not to supervise, he was careful about that, never once suggesting that Garrett was doing something incorrectly or should do something differently. He came the way a man comes to a place that still belongs to his memory, even when it has passed to someone else carefully, with a deliberate awareness of his own position. He would sit at the counter, drink coffee, and watch Garrett work. Sometimes he offered information where a specific tool was stored, the history of a particular repair, which supplier had the best pricing on kitchen supplies. Practical things. He offered them quietly and without fanfare, the way a man passes along what he knows when he understands he will not be passing it along much longer. They did not talk again about the photograph or about Donovan directly, though. His presence was always in the room between them, not as a shadow, but as a kind of weight that both men carried without needing to name it to each other. The two men appeared on a Thursday afternoon in early December, when Garrett was on the roof again, checking the flashing he had repaired against a forecast of freezing rain. He heard the truck before he saw it, an older model Chevy dark green pulling into the parking lot with the particular deliberateness of a vehicle whose driver is paying attention. Two men got out. Both were in their early 70s. Both wore jackets that had seen real use, not fashioned to look worn, just actually worn the way things look when they have been used correctly over time. Both wore caps. One said Desert Storm. The other said U.S. Army and had a small American flag patch on the brim. They looked at the building. They looked at Garrett on the roof. They looked at each other. Then they went to their truck, opened the bed, and began taking out tools. Garrett watched this from the roof and did not say anything. The men did not explain themselves. One of them found a ladder leaning against the far side of the building, Garrett's ladder, and propped it up and came up onto the roof. He looked at what Garrett was doing, assessed it with the eyes of someone who had done roof work before, and then positioned himself at the east end of the flashing seam and began to work. The other man went into the diner. Garrett could hear him moving around in the kitchen, methodical, careful, not disturbing anything. Just looking the way people look at a machine to understand how it is working before they decide where to apply themselves. By 4 in the afternoon, there were 3 more men in the parking lot. They had come separately, one at a time, as though the first truck's arrival had sent a signal on a frequency that Garrett could not detect. A Navy veteran in his early 80s who moved slowly but worked without stopping. Two other Gulf War veterans who had served together in 1991 and who communicated in the compressed shorthand of men who have shared significant time in close quarters. No one introduced themselves to Garrett directly. No one asked permission. They moved into the work the way water moves into available space, finding the gaps, filling them without drama or announcement. Garrett was not a man who accepted help easily. That was the truth of it, and he knew it well enough to name it honestly to himself. He had been built by temperament and then by training around the capacity for self-sufficiency, and somewhere along the way, that capacity had calcified into something more rigid, an inability to let people stand beside him without experiencing it as an imposition or a judgment or both. It was the thing his ex-wife had named once quietly and without cruelty in one of their last real conversations. The way he made helping him feel unwelcome so that after a while people stopped trying, which confirmed something in him that he would have been better off having challenged. He stood on the roof in the late afternoon light and watched five men he did not know working on a building he had owned for less than a month, and he did not know what to do with it. So he did what soldiers do when the protocol is unclear. He went back to work. By the third week of December, the building was functional, not beautiful, not finished in the sense of a renovation magazine, but functional in the way that mattered. The kitchen worked, the heat worked, the plumbing worked, the roof held the windows, no longer let in weather that had not been invited. It was a diner that could operate. Whether it would operate was a different question. Garrett opened on a Tuesday. He had not advertised. He had not put anything on the sign beyond turning it on. He had not told anyone except Emmett, who nodded when Garrett mentioned it and said he would stop by for coffee. That first day, three people came in. Two were the Gulf War veterans who had worked on the roof. The third was a woman in her 60s who had seen the open sign from the road and come in for pie, which Garrett did not have. He gave her coffee and a slice of cornbread he had made because he needed something to make, and it was what he had ingredients for. She said it was good paid and left. Garrett stood in the empty diner at 4 in the afternoon and looked at the $3.50 on the counter. Atlas looked at the money from across the room. "Don't," Garrett said. Atlas looked away. The second week was different. He could not have predicted how or why because the mechanism of it was invisible to him. But on Monday morning of the second week, when he unlocked the front door at 6:30 and turned the sign to open, there were already two men in the parking lot sitting in a truck with the engine off. He recognized one of them from the roof work. The other was new. They came in. Garrett poured coffee without being asked. They sat at the counter, not speaking much, looking at the surface of the cups the way men look at things when thinking is the primary activity. Atlas moved through the room on his morning circuit and then settled near the end of the counter. By 8 o'clock, there were 6 people in the diner. By the end of that week, it had become a thing, not a crowd, not anything that would register as significant to an observer from outside, but consistent 8, 10, sometimes 12 people in the mornings, mostly men, mostly of a certain age and background, filling the stools and the booths with a specific quality of presence that belongs to people who have nothing to prove and are not trying to be anything in particular. What they had found Garrett would come to understand was not the food, though the food was honest and properly made. It was not even the diner itself. It was the quality of the space. There was no television mounted above the counter, running cable news at volume. There was no music piped through speakers. There was no ambient soundtrack beyond the kitchen sounds and the weather outside, and the occasional low conversation between two people who had chosen to have it. In a world that had become nearly impossible to be quiet in, this was a room where quiet was not just permitted, but preserved the way certain things need preserving once you understand how rarely they occur naturally. Garrett had not designed it that way. He had simply never gotten around to installing a television or finding a radio he liked. But the effect was real, and the people who found it felt it, and they came back. Atlas walked among them, slowly pausing at each table, receiving the hands that reached toward him and accepting the weight of them with the gravity and patience of someone who understands that sometimes a hand on the back of a twig is the closest a person can get to saying something they cannot say in any other way. It was the first week of January when Garrett found the loan documents. He had been going through the filing cabinet in the back office, a piece of furniture he had been avoiding because going through someone else's papers felt like a different kind of intrusion than fixing someone else's roof, and in the bottom drawer beneath a folder of utility receipts, going back to 2012, he found a manila envelope. Inside were documents from a bank in Burlington, a personal loan agreement dated August 2001. The amount was $51,000. He read through the documents carefully, twice the way he read everything that mattered. Not quickly, not skimming, but with the full attention of a man who has learned that the detail you miss is the one that costs you. The original loan had been taken against Emmett's personal assets, not the business. A second page dated 2015 showed a loan restructuring agreement. The debt had been converted to an unsecured personal loan, the building released as collateral at that point. The purpose listed on the original application was a single-line college tuition and expenses, D. Calloway. Garrett sat back in the office chair. He thought about what Emmett had told him assembled across weeks of conversation that Donovan had enrolled at a university in Burlington, had been accepted into an engineering program, had been in Emmett's telling, quietly brilliant at mathematics in a way that had surprised his teachers and delighted his father. That the plan had been college then, whatever came after college. Then September 2001 had happened. Donovan had been 20 years old. He had withdrawn from enrollment in October of that year, 5 weeks into his first semester, and enlisted in the Army. Emmett had not tried to stop him. He understood why, even if it broke something in him that had not been repaired. The tuition loan had never been used for its purpose, but Emmett had never paid it back. For 14 years, he had serviced the interest, and then in 2015, he had restructured it, made it clean, separated it from the building, but the principal remained sitting in a bank file the way certain things sit, not forgotten, not addressed, just carried. Garrett sat with this for a long time. 22 years of a loan not repaid, and he thought he understood why not, because Emmett was careless or irresponsible, but because repaying it meant closing a chapter that some part of Emmett was not willing to close. The loan existed for Donovan's future. Paying it off meant declaring formally that the future it had been borrowed for was not going to happen, that the tuition money was now just debt, and the reason for the debt was gone. Emmett had chosen to carry the weight of it rather than put it down. Garrett looked at the document in his hands. He thought about the building he was sitting in, which now had his name on the deed, clean, unencumbered, exactly as Emmett had said. He thought about Emmett's voice saying, "I don't know the exact number." He thought about the specific texture of that statement, not dishonest, not quite evasive, but careful. The careful omission of a man who wants you to stay and knows that obligation and choice are not the same thing, and that confusing them at the wrong moment can ruin both. He put the documents back in the envelope. He put the envelope back in the drawer. He sat in the office for a long time after that, not thinking about the money, or not only about the money, but about the shape of things, about the way a person's life, when you understand enough of it, begins to reveal its own logic. The way events that look random from the outside have at their center a person doing the best they can with what they believe and what they fear and what they love. Emmett had borrowed money for a son who went to war instead of college. He had kept paying the interest on that money for over 2 decades, the way you keep a room, as it was not from denial, but from a form of love that does not know what else to do with itself. And then he had given the building free and clear to a stranger who had known his son. Garrett had thought when Emmett signed the deed that he understood what was being offered. He was beginning to understand that he had only understood the surface of it. He decided somewhere in the quiet of that back office that he would find a way to repay the debt. Not because he was legally obligated, the building was clean, Emmett had made sure of that, but because some obligations are not legal, Some obligations are the kind that exist between people who understand what was paid for and what it cost, and who would rather carry the weight themselves than let an old man's last act of generosity go unanswered. He did not know yet how, but he put it down as something to work toward the way he had always put difficult things, not pushed away, not obsessed over, just held in the part of his mind reserved for problems that would yield to patience and time. The appointment at the veterinary clinic in Montpellier was on the second Thursday of January. It was a routine visit, or what passed for routine for a retired working dog of Atlas's age. Weight check, joint assessment, blood work. Garrett had been monitoring Atlas's back left leg through the winter with the same systematic attention he gave to everything that mattered. And while the dog had not declined sharply, the hesitation in the mornings had become more pronounced when the temperature dropped significantly and Garrett wanted a professional assessment rather than his own. He drove the 40 minutes to Montpellier on a morning that was clear and brutally cold. The sky a hard pale blue above the white hills, the road straight through country that was beautiful and indifferent in equal measure. Atlas sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window with the specific contentment of a dog who likes being in motion. The vet was a woman in her late 40s named Dr. Halverson, who worked with service and working dogs and who understood without needing it, explained the particular relationship between the man and the dog she was looking at. She was efficient and precise and gentle in the way of someone for whom gentleness is a professional tool rather than an emotional reflex. She did the assessment. She took the blood work. She asked Garrett several questions about Atlas's behavior activity level and the specific circumstances in which the hesitation in his leg was most pronounced. She wrote notes. She was calm. When she came back into the exam room, she was still calm, which told Garrett something before she said anything. "There's a mass," she said, "in the bone, left rear femur." She showed him the imaging. Osteosarcoma, early stage. "What this means is—" "I know what it means," Garrett said. She looked at him. Then she nodded and explained it anyway because that was her job. And because the knowing of a thing and the hearing of it, said aloud, are different experiences. The cancer was slow-moving at this stage. With appropriate management, pain medication, monitored activity, anti-inflammatories, regular imaging, Atlas could have quality of life for a significant period, months, potentially longer, depending on progression. The disease would eventually limit his mobility. In time, it would do more than that. There were treatment options that could extend the timeline further, with trade-offs she explained carefully and without softening. Garrett listened to everything. He asked 3 specific questions about the anti-inflammatory protocols and the imaging schedule. He asked about cold weather and joint impact on a dog with this diagnosis. He listened to the answers completely. He thanked Dr. Halverson. Then he paid the bill, put Atlas's leash back on, and walked with him to the truck. He sat in the parking lot with the engine off for a long time. Atlas put his head on Garrett's thigh. Garrett put his hand on the back of Atlas's neck in the place where the fur was thickest, and sat in the silence of the parking lot while the cold pressed against the windows and the traffic on the road behind them moved in both directions, and the world continued doing what the world does, which is continue. He thought about the fact that he had signed a deed to a building in a town he had never heard of 4 months ago, and that the diner beside him now had a tumor in his leg, and that the diner had a debt of $51,000 attached to a story about a young man who had chosen war over engineering, and that somewhere in all of this, there was a shape he could not yet fully see but could feel at its edges, the way you feel a large thing in a dark room by its presence, by the way it displaces the air around it. He took out his phone. He found the number Emmett had written on a card and handed him 2 weeks prior, as though he had anticipated a moment when Garrett would need it. He called. Emmett answered on the 3rd ring. "Garrett, I'm in Montpelier." He paused, not because he did not know what to say, because he was not yet practiced at saying things to people without a specific operational purpose. They found something. In Atlas, his leg. A silence. The kind that means someone is fully present on the other end. "What kind of something?" Emmett said. "Bone cancer, early, They say we have time to manage it. Emmett was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man who has processed loss before and knows how to be present in the space it makes. Then he said, the best friend I ever had was a black lab named Chester. Chester got old. His back end started going on him when he was about 11. I kept meeting him at the corner of my yard every morning for 3 years after that, even when he could barely make the walk. He paused. People thought I was making it harder on him by not letting him slow down. They were wrong. He needed to keep meeting me at that corner. That was how he knew he still had a job. Garrett looked at Atlas. I'm going to fix the storage room, Garrett said. Properly, so it's warmer. The cold's bad for his joints. I know a man who can get you insulation at Sham, Emmett said. I'll call him tonight. They did not say much more than that, but when Garrett put the phone down, something in him had shifted. Some internal configuration had moved slightly and permanently towards something he had not expected to find in a parking lot in Montpelier in January. He had called someone, not because he needed information, not because there was a problem to solve that required another person's input, because something had happened and he had needed a person to tell. He did not examine this too carefully. He started the engine and drove back toward Millhaven, and Atlas watched the white hills through the window, and the afternoon light moved across the snow in long horizontal lines, the color of old gold. The man came in on a Tuesday night in late January when the last customers had left at 8, and Garrett was going through his closing routine. He heard the door and looked up. A young man stood in the doorway, 24, maybe 25. He was wearing a military jacket, the kind issued not purchased with the specific cut and weight of government-issue cold-weather gear, a branch insignia on the sleeve faded enough to suggest it had seen real use. His face was the face of someone young who had recently been in contact with something that aging usually takes decades to accomplish. Not old, honestly not old, but changed in the irreversible way that certain experiences change people. He looked at the diner as though he was not entirely certain it was real. We're open, Garrett said. What do you need? Coffee, the young man said. If that's okay. It's always okay. He sat at the booth in the far corner, the one with its back to the wall, and a clear line of sight to the door. Garrett noticed this without commenting on it. He brought the coffee and set it down and went back behind the counter. The young man looked at the surface of the table. He did not look at Garrett. He did not look at the walls or the photographs or anything that required sustained attention directed outward. He looked at the table the way people look at something that is not really there through it, at whatever was happening on the inside of his eyes. After a while, Atlas rose from his position near the counter. He walked across the diner slowly with the measured deliberateness his condition had given him, and stopped at the edge of the young man's table. He did not press forward or make demands. He simply stood there, present, available, patient, in the way that only certain animals and certain people ever manage to be truly patient. The young man looked at Atlas. Something moved across his face. It came and went quickly, the way a weather change passes over open water, present, and then on, but you saw it. He reached down and put his hand on Atlas's head, gently. The way you touch something you are not sure you are permitted to touch. Atlas sat. He did not perform comfort. He simply sat beside the table in the particular way he sat when he was keeping company with someone settled present entirely without requirement. Garrett made himself busy behind the counter. The young man sat in the corner booth for 2 hours. He drank 2 cups of coffee and said nothing beyond thank you when the second cup arrived. He did not look at his phone. He did not look at the other tables or the windows or the photographs on the walls. He looked at the table and at Atlas and occasionally at a point in the middle distance that contained something only he could see. At 5 minutes past 10, he stood. He put money on the table, more than the coffee cost, and put on his jacket. He walked to the door and then stopped. He turned back. Garrett looked up. Is it always this quiet? The young man said. Garrett looked around the empty diner. Yeah, he said. Pretty much. The young man stood there for a moment, as though he was memorizing the room, storing something about it for later use. "Okay," he said, and went out the door. Garrett stood behind the counter and listened to the sound of a car starting in the parking lot and then pulling out and moving away down the main street until the sound of it was gone completely. Atlas walked back to the counter and lay down. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows, and the street light in the parking lot lit the empty space where a car had just been, and the town of Millhaven sat quiet in the long dark of a Vermont January, and in the diner that now bore his name on a deed in a county filing office, Garrett Mercer stood still in the silence and felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like he was in the right place. The young man would come back 4 more times over the following 3 weeks, always late, always the corner booth, always the same quality of contained, watchful presence. Somewhere between here and wherever it was he kept disappearing to inside himself. He never initiated conversation, and Garrett did not press him. This was, after all, what the diner had become, a place where not talking was not only acceptable, but understood as its own form of communication. But Garrett watched him across those 4 visits and understood something about what he was seeing. The young man was not waiting for something to happen. He was building towards something. You could see it in the incremental changes across the visits, the way his posture shifted slightly, the way his eyes began occasionally to find the photographs on the walls, the way he started arriving marginally earlier each time, as though the distance between himself and whatever he needed to say was slowly, steadily closing. On the 4th visit, the young man had sat longer than usual and left without his usual abruptness. He had paused at the door, hand on the frame, and looked back at the room, at the photographs, at the counter, at Atlas, with an expression Garrett recognized because he had seen it in mirrors, the expression of a person deciding whether the ground beneath their feet is solid enough to bear what they intend to put on it. He had turned and left without speaking, but the next morning he came back. Garrett had not yet had time to note the difference in timing. It was a Friday afternoon, not the young man's usual hour, when the door opened and he walked in. And this time, before he sat down, before he ordered coffee, before he did anything else, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a photograph. That was when Garrett understood that the visits had not been about coffee. They had been about deciding whether to do this, whether to come back one more time and place something on the counter that could not be taken back once it was placed there. He had spent 3 weeks deciding that the answer was yes. His name, Garrett would learn in the next few minutes, was Sawyer Holt, and everything was about to change. Part 3, the mission he didn't know. He was on the photograph was taken on a Wednesday morning in February. Garrett did not know it was being taken. That was part of what made it what it was, the absence of performance, the complete lack of anyone adjusting their posture or their expression for the benefit of a camera. It was simply a moment that happened to be seen by someone who had been there long enough to recognize that certain moments are worth keeping. 4 men sat along the counter. All of them were past 60. All of them had come in separately, as they usually did, and ended up in proximity the way regulars end up in proximity, not by arrangement, but by the accumulation of habit that eventually becomes its own kind of intention. They were drinking coffee. One of them was looking at the window. One was reading a folded newspaper with the deliberate attention of a man who still believes in the printed word and is correct to do so. 2 were talking in the low, unhurried way of people who have enough shared history that conversation does not need to start from the beginning every time. At the far end of the counter, Atlas lay with his head resting on the edge of the last stool, his eyes half open, his breathing slow. His gray muzzle caught the morning light in a way that made him look briefly like something carved from pale stone, solid and patient and permanent. His posture was the posture of a dog entirely at rest in a place entirely his own. Sawyer Holt had come in early that morning. He had been coming in for 3 weeks, always the corner booth, and this was the first morning he had arrived before the regulars. He sat in his usual seat and held his phone loosely in his right hand and looked at the room the way he had been looking at the room across 3 weeks of early mornings and late nights, with the attention of someone measuring a thing he intends to carry. He raised the phone once and took one photograph without framing it consciously, the way people sometimes take photographs of things that seem in a sudden unguarded moment worth keeping, regardless of whether anyone else ever sees them. He posted it before he was fully aware he intended to. The caption read, "Found the most honest diner in America. Callaway's, Millhaven, Vermont. No agenda, no noise, just coffee, an old dog, and people who don't need to explain themselves." Garrett did not see the post that morning. He had no reason to be watching the platform it appeared on, and no one in the diner that morning was monitoring their phone with the kind of attention that catches things in the moment they happen. By noon, 400 people had shared it. By the following morning, it was something else entirely. The first car he did not recognize pulled in at 8:15 on a Thursday, a Connecticut plate. Two men in their mid-50s who came in with the slightly careful manner of people who are not sure they are in the right place, but are hoping they are. They looked at the counter, at the photographs on the walls at Atlas resting by the far stool. One of them said, "This is the place from the picture, not to Garrett, but to the other man. The way you confirm something you were not entirely certain was real before you were standing in front of it." They sat. They ordered coffee. They said very little. They left a $20 bill under the saucer. By the end of that week, there were out-of-state plates in the parking lot every morning. Not many. This was not the kind of thing that sent tour buses. But a specific kind of person had found the photograph and felt something specific when they found it, and a specific kind of person acts on that feeling rather than simply carrying it through their day. And those people got in their cars and drove. Veterans mostly, some recently retired, some not. Some with the bearing of recent service still on them, that particular economy of movement and expression that takes years to fully release. Some older men in their 70s who had served in places that had been the defining geography of their lives, and who had spent the decades since finding ways to carry that without letting it define everything else too. Families came too, wives and adult children of veterans who saw the photograph and understood something about it that they recognized from living alongside people who needed rooms like this one. Firefighters, police officers, a handful of people who had simply been broken by the ordinary world in ordinary ways, and who saw in the photograph of in four quiet men something they were hungry for without having known what to call the hunger. They came because the diner offered something that had become harder and harder to find. Not therapy, not programming, not organized support of any kind. Just a room that asked nothing of the people in it and gave them silence and coffee and the particular companionship of a dog who had been through something himself and was still showing up every morning. Garrett had not built this. He needed to be clear about that, at least to himself, in the private accounting he conducted during the early morning walks with Atlas before anyone arrived. He had built a functioning diner and then forgotten to add noise. The rest of it had arrived on its own, drawn by whatever invisible force draws people toward places that feel honest when they have been surrounded for too long by places that feel like performance. He hired a woman from town named Bev Hartley, 62, whose husband had served 2 tours during Desert Storm, and who understood, without needing it, explained the specific way to be present in a room full of people who needed you to require nothing of them. She moved through the diner with the efficiency of someone who had raised 4 children and run a household for 30 years, and who knew exactly how much could be accomplished by people who paid attention and spoke only when speaking served a purpose. Atlas continued his rounds slower now, the medication managing the pain well enough that his deliberateness looked more like wisdom than limitation. His morning patrol of the room had become something that the regulars watched for, the slow circuit from counter to booths and back again, the unhurried acknowledgement of each table, the way he would stop sometimes and simply stand beside someone for a moment before moving on, offering nothing beyond presence, which turned out to be exactly enough. It was a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of February when Sawyer Holt finally sat at the counter instead of the corner booth. Garrett was behind the counter. The lunch crowd had thinned to 3 people in the booths, and Bev was finishing the counter cleanup. The door opened, and Sawyer came in, and something about the way he moved was different from every previous visit, not the contained, carefully managed stillness of someone who is not yet sure where they stand, but the more deliberate movement of someone who has made a decision and is walking toward it. He sat at the counter 2 stools from the end. Garrett set down a coffee without being asked. Sawyer Holt put his hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment. A long moment, the kind in which a person is not looking at the coffee, but past it, checking one final time whether they are ready for what comes next. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a photograph. He set it on the counter and pushed it gently toward Garrett. It was a 4x6 print. The color slightly oversaturated the way phone photographs printed at a drugstore sometimes are. 2 men in military attire standing against a sand-colored wall in what was clearly a forward operating base. The specific visual grammar of those places was unmistakable to anyone who had been in them. One of the men was clearly the source of the young man across the counter, the same jaw, the same eyes, an older version of what was sitting in front of Garrett now. That man had his arm half raised in the way of men who are not comfortable being photographed, but are tolerating it for the sake of the other person. He was smiling slightly. The other man in the photograph was Garrett, 10 years younger, in a place he did not need to name. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. He looked at the version of himself in it, close enough to recognize, far enough to observe the way you observe your own past self, with the specific combination of recognition and distance that only time provides. Then he looked at the young man across the counter. "Donovan," Garrett said, not a question. "My brother," Sawyer said. "Yes." The diner was quiet around them. Bev had moved to the far end of the room with the practiced discretion of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding when a space needs to be left alone. Garrett looked at the photograph again. At Donovan Calloway captured in afternoon light at a forward operating base in a country that had cost both of them more than could be easily measured. He looked at Donovan's face, settled, purposeful, entirely himself, and felt the specific weight of that image, the way certain photographs carry not just the moment they contain, but everything that came after. "When did you get back?" Garrett asked. 8 months ago." Sawyer looked at his coffee. "Second deployment, different unit, different theater, but—" He stopped, started again. "Some things don't care about the location." Garrett nodded. "I found the photograph online," Sawyer said, "the one someone posted, of this place." He looked at the counter at Atlas resting at the far end of it. "I've been here 4 times since then. I wasn't—" He exhaled slowly. "I wasn't sure what I was going to say when I actually talked to you. I kept coming back to figure that out." "You don't have to say anything," Garrett said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "That's why I kept coming back. Because here was the one place I didn't feel like I had to." There was a quality of stillness in the diner just then, not the comfortable background stillness of a room at rest, but the active stillness of a room paying attention to something important. Atlas rose from his position at the far end of the counter. He walked the length of it slowly and stopped beside Sawyer's stool. He did not press for contact. He stood there present and available in the way he had been standing beside people in this diner for months, not performing comfort, just offering the uncomplicated fact of his company. Sawyer put his hand on Atlas's head. "He wrote about you," Sawyer said. "Donovan, in the letters home. Not often. He didn't write about specific people very often. He said it felt like bad luck." He kept his hand on Atlas. "But a few times." He said, his voice changed slightly, the way voices change when they are carrying something precise and fragile that they have been holding for a long time and are only now setting down. He said you were the kind of man he would want next to him when things went wrong. Said that was the highest thing he knew how to say about a person. The kitchen was very still. Garrett looked at the photograph on the counter. He looked at the version of Donovan Calloway captured in afternoon light and thought about the last time he had seen him, not in the photograph, not in the frame of memory he usually allowed himself when he thought of Donovan at all, but the actual last time. the last real moment between them. The sequence of events that had unfolded faster than any plan and ended in a way that only one of them could walk away from. He had never said it aloud, not to the debriefers who had asked careful, structured questions in the weeks after, not to the base counselor who had made himself available in the specific official way that base counselors do, not to the men in his unit who had shared the loss and processed it in the compressed, functional way that soldiers process loss because there is no alternative that allows the mission to continue. He had carried it in silence for 3 years because silence felt like the only container that could hold it without leaking. He saved my life, Garrett said. The mission that he stopped started again more slowly with the care of someone releasing something that has been under pressure for a very long time. There was a sequence of events that moved faster than the plan. Donovan saw something I didn't see in time. He moved. He looked at the photograph. He moved before I did, which is why I'm here and he isn't. Sawyer was very still. He made a choice, Garrett said. It was a clear choice. He knew what it was. There was nothing. He stopped again, and the pause was the pause of a man going through every version one final time, knowing he has been through all of them 1,000 times already, and knowing the answer is always the same. There was nothing I could have done to change the order of it. I've been through every version. There is no version where I move fast enough. He looked at the young man. But I've spent 3 years living in the version where I didn't. Sawyer was looking at him with the steady, clear-eyed attention of someone who has learned to hear hard things without flinching, who has had hard things said to him, and understands that flinching does not help either person in the room. He knew the risk, Sawyer said. He knew it every single time he went out. That's not... He paused, finding the right words, with the careful attention of someone who has thought about this specific conversation many times before having it. That's not something you're supposed to carry for him. He made the choice. He had made it 100 times in 100 smaller ways before that final one. He looked at Atlas. That's what the letter said, that you were the kind of man worth making choices for. Garrett did not say anything for a long while. Outside, a car pulled into the parking lot. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps on cold asphalt, then the sound of the entrance door. Garrett looked at Sawyer Holt, at the young man with his brother's joy in his brother's eyes, and 8 months of his own version of the same weight Garrett had been carrying, sitting at the counter with his hand on an old dog's head. He thought about the 3 weeks Sawyer had spent working up to this moment, coming in at night after night, to a corner booth saying nothing, deciding slowly the way important decisions are made when you are paying attention to them. Where are you staying? Garrett said. I drove from Burlington. I was going to turn around and drive back tonight. Garrett looked at him steadily. The storage room is too small for 2 people, but there's an inn 2 blocks north that has a weekly rate that isn't unreasonable. Sawyer looked at him. The diner opens at 6:30. Oi, Garrett said. I could use someone who knows how to work without being told every step. Something moved in Sawyer's face. Not quite a smile, but close the expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just been offered a place to set it down. Not permanently and not without condition, but for now, which was what he needed. For now was enough. For now was somewhere to start from. I'll find the inn, Sawyer said. Emmett died on a Thursday in the last week of February. It was not unexpected. Garrett had known for weeks in the way you know things when you are paying attention, and the thing you are watching is moving in a direction that only goes one way. Emmett's visits to the diner had become shorter in January, and in February he had stopped coming altogether, which was the kind of signal that requires no interpretation from a man trained to read environments accurately. Garrett had driven to Emmett's house twice a week and sat with him, not performing vigil, not making the visit into something ceremonial, just sitting in the way that people who are not afraid of silence sit to hear when one of them is running out of time. They had talked. Not about everything. There were things Emmett was too tired to revisit and Garrett too respectful to press. but enough that by the end, Garrett felt he understood the shape of Emmett Calloway's life the way you understand something when it has been given to you directly rather than assembled from fragments across a great distance. On the last real visit, Emmett had been sitting in the chair by the window. In the way he had been sitting in that chair for weeks, not sleeping, not fully alert, but present in the specific way of people who are spending the last of something carefully. The winter light came through the window he had always kept partially open, regardless of temperature, because he said a room without outside air was just a box with furniture in it. Garrett had sat in the chair across from him. Atlas had lain between them on the floor, and Emmett had rested one hand on the dog's back for a long time without speaking. It went fast, Emmett had said finally. That's what nobody tells you. The actual end part goes fast. It's the middle that takes forever. Garrett had not said anything. There was nothing to say that was worth the space it would take up. You'll stay, Emmett had said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Garrett had said. Emmett had nodded and closed his eyes, and they had sat together in the winter light until Garrett needed to get back to the diner. And Emmett, without opening his eyes, had said, the sign. Don't forget the sign. Emmett died on a Thursday morning in his own house in the room where he had slept since 1964, with the winter light coming through the window he had always kept partially open. A day later, the physician who had been managing Emmett's care called Garrett. He said that Emmett had prepared a letter some months prior and left instructions that it be delivered to Garrett after his death, not to his estate, to Garrett specifically in person promptly. Garrett drove to the physician's office and picked up the envelope. He did not open it there. He drove back to the diner parked in the lot and sat in the truck with the engine off. Atlas sat beside him. The parking lot was empty at this hour, the maple tree casting its bare shadow across the painted spaces, the light flat and gray above the hills. He opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages handwritten in the careful cursive of a generation for whom handwriting was a skill, taught with deliberateness and maintained through decades of practice. The penmanship was steady and precise until the last page, where it loosened slightly, not from carelessness, but from fatigue, and the loosening made those final lines feel more intimate than the rest, as though the long discipline had softened it at the end and let something through that the discipline had been not hiding exactly, but holding in reserve for the right moment. Emmett had written that he was diagnosed in the spring, 9 months before Garrett arrived in Millhaven, that the diagnosis was not survivable, and that the timeline was the kind doctors give with margins wide enough that you cannot plan around them precisely, but narrow enough that you understand the general direction. That he had known when he made the decision about the diner exactly what he was doing and exactly what he was setting in motion. He had not been impulsive. He had not been confused. He had not been the fragile old man acting on sentiment that could be explained away by grief or age or a mind no longer fully in command of itself. He had been a man with a clear mind and a limited amount of time, making a decision he had arrived at through deliberate, patient reasoning over the course of many months. He wrote that he had read a short piece in a regional paper about a program that worked with veterans transitioning out of service. The kind of small journalism that still exists in places like Vermont that covers the human texture of communities rather than the news cycle. The piece had mentioned Garrett by name in passing briefly as someone working through the program's resources in the Burlington area. Emmett had kept the paper. He had thought about it for 2 months. He had made a decision. I was not waiting for a caretaker, he wrote. I was not looking for someone to manage my final chapter. I was looking for a door. Not for me. I found my door 40 years ago and walked through it every morning since. I was looking for a door for someone who needed one. Donovan needed a door once. He was enrolled. He had his books. He had a room. And then the world changed the way the world sometimes does all at once, and the door closed before he could walk through it. I have spent more than 20 years coming to terms with the fact that I cannot change that. What I can do is hold a door open for someone else and trust that the right person will walk through it. You walk through mine the way Donovan would have without asking permission, without making a production of it, just coming in and seeing what needed to be done and doing it. If you had come in that first morning and taken your coffee and left and not returned, I would have understood. But you came back. Every morning you came back. And I knew about the debt. The loan was restructured in 2015, and the building was released as collateral at that time, so the building is yours without any encumbrance. The debt is personal, and it is real, and I am sorry I was not more precise about the number. But I want you to know what it was for if you don't already know, and I suspect you do, because you are the kind of man who finds things when he goes looking. It was for Donovan's future. He chose a different future. The debt remained not because I forgot it, but because I was not ready to close the account. You may do with it what you judge best. It is separate from the building entirely. The last thing, the sign. Storage room left wall behind the cleaning supplies. I made it in 1964, 2 weeks before we opened. Eleanor said it was the kind of thing that people either understand immediately or never understand at all, and that the ones who don't understand it were probably not going to be regulars anyway. She was right about most things. She was right about that. Hang it where people can see it when they walk in. It has been in the dark long enough. It was always meant to be seen. You don't owe me anything, but if you want to pay a debt, be here when the next one walks through the door. That's all. That's the whole of it. Emmett Garrett sat in the truck for a long time. He sat until the flat gray light shifted toward the particular quality of late afternoon when the color went out of the sky before the dark fully arrived, and everything looked briefly like a photograph of itself. He sat until Atlas shifted beside him and looked at him with the patient, informative gaze that meant it was time to go back inside. He went into the storage room. The sign was exactly where Emmett had said it would be, on the left wall behind the cleaning supplies, wrapped in an old canvas drop cloth that had protected it from dust and time. He unwrapped it carefully on the floor of the storage room. It was a piece of hardwood oak, approximately 2 feet wide and 14 inches tall, planned smooth and finished with something that had held its quality across 60 years of storage. The letters had been carved into the wood rather than painted onto it, carved with a hand tool by someone who had taken care with the depth and spacing and angle of each letter, so that the shadows they cast would change with the light, making the words slightly different at different times of day. Not different in meaning. Different in character, the way the same true thing can feel different depending on the quality of the light you read it in. Kindness is the mission. Below it, in smaller letters of the same careful carving, Callaway's Diner established 1964. Garrett ran his thumb along the carved letters. The wood was warm in a way that old, well-kept wood is warm, as though it had absorbed decades of the temperature of the hands that had held it, and the rooms that had contained it, and was returning that warmth now, with interest, to the first hands that had touched it in years. He carried it out to the diner. He hung it himself above the entrance, centered on the wall, so that it was the first thing visible when the door opened. Not immediately obvious from outside, not theatrical or demanding, but present in the way of something that belongs exactly where it is, and has always belonged there and has simply been waiting to be returned to its right place. He stepped back and looked at it for a long time. Below the sign on the wall to the right, he made space among the photographs that had accumulated over the months. He found the photograph Emmett had shown him on the first night, Donovan in uniform, Garrett in the corner, both of them squinting into afternoon light at a forward operating base, the photograph Emmett had kept for 3 years, and then placed on a diner counter at exactly the right moment. He framed it simply and hung it beside a photograph of Emmett behind the counter in 1968, young and serious, and clearly exactly where he had chosen to be and intended to remain. Then he found the photograph Sawyer had brought in on that Friday afternoon and placed on the counter. He framed that one too. 3 photographs. 3 men, 1 wall beneath a carved oak sign that had spent 60 years in the dark and was finally where it was supposed to be. It was a Saturday morning 10 days after Emmett's death when Garrett arrived before 6 to find something on the counter. He had unlocked the front door in the dark, as usual, moved through the diner, running the opening checklist in the order he always ran it, and gone behind the counter to start the coffee. He almost missed it, a manila envelope placed squarely in the center of the counter, his name written on the front in handwriting he did not recognize. Careful handwriting. The handwriting of someone more accustomed to tools and to pens, each letter formed with the particular deliberateness of a person who does not write often, but takes the act seriously when they do. He opened it. Inside were checks and folded bills organized with the same kind of care that had gone into the handwriting. He counted them once, then again, then a third time with the specific methodical attention of a man who does not trust himself to believe a number until he has confirmed it multiple times. $51,200. There was a single note card in the envelope written on the kind of ruled index card that comes in packs of 100. The handwriting matched the envelope. We heard about the loan. Don't ask how people talk in small towns, and people who have been in tight spots know the shape of one when they hear about it. 47 names on the back of this card. None of us doing this because we think you can't handle it yourself. Doing it because that's not how we do things. Nobody carries the weight alone. That's not how it works, and you know it better than anyone. He turned the card over. 47 names. Some he recognized, the Gulf War veterans who had come up on the roof without being asked, the regulars who had been filling the morning counter since before the diner was properly finished. Most he did not. Names from neighboring towns, from elsewhere in the county, from places he had never been. People who had heard about the diner and come once or twice and felt something in it that made them feel in the specific way that people who have served together feel things, that it was theirs to protect. That it belonged to them the way the places that have sheltered you belong to you, not by ownership, but by the deeper claim of having needed them and having been answered. Garrett stood behind the counter with the envelope in his hands. Atlas was watching him from across the room. He set the envelope down. He put both hands flat on the counter and stood there looking at the room around him, at the morning light beginning to make its slow way through the windows, at the sign above the entrance that read, "Kindness is the mission," in carved letters that were already different in this early light than they had been in the afternoon light the day before. At the three photographs on the wall, Emmett Young and certain Donovan in the afternoon sun of a place too far away, Garrett standing beside a man who had chosen without hesitation to stand beside him. He had come to this town in November because Atlas needed to stop moving. He had walked into this diner because the light was on at an hour when most lights were not. He had signed a piece of paper for $1 because an old man who had been watching people for 78 years had seen something in him that he could not yet see in himself, and had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to say so. And somehow in the months between that November morning and this one, something had happened that he did not have a word for yet. Not recovery, that word was too clinical, too focused on the return to a prior state, and he was not trying to return to anything. The man he had been before was not the destination. Not healing, that word implied a wound as the primary fact, and while he had wounds, what had happened here was not primarily about the wounds. It was about the thing that had grown in the space around them, in the cold, in the work, in the silence, in the mom, and the old man and the strangers who had shown up on his roof with tools, and the young men who had come in from the dark and sat in corner booths until they could breathe. It was about purpose, not the purpose of a mission briefed and executed and debriefed and filed. A different kind. The kind that does not come with orders or a clear objective or a defined end state or a commanding officer who can tell you when you have done enough. The kind that reveals itself over time from the inside through the accumulation of days in which you show up and pay attention and do what needs to be done and let the people who need to find you find you. The door opened. Sawyer Holt came in with a cold behind him, stamping snow from his boots, moving directly to the coat hooks near the door, and hanging up his jacket the way someone hangs up a jacket in a place that belongs to them, without thought, without ceremony, with the ease of a thing done so many times that it has stopped requiring attention. He had been there every morning for 3 weeks, arriving before opening, leaving after close learning the rhythms of the kitchen and the counter and the particular requirements of each regular without being instructed in any of it. He looked at Garrett, then at the envelope on the counter. "What's that?" Garrett pushed it across the counter without saying anything. Sawyer read the note card. He looked at the amount. He turned the card over and looked at the 47 names moving through them, slowly stopping occasionally when a name meant something to him, the muscles in his jaw working slightly in the way of someone holding an expression in place because they need to. "Okay," Sawyer said finally. He put the card down with the care of someone setting something fragile on a solid surface. He went to the kitchen, turned on the grill, and began the prep in the ordered, efficient way he had developed over 3 weeks of paying attention to how the kitchen moved and what it needed and when. Garrett listened to the sounds of the kitchen starting up, the grill heating, the coffee completing its cycle, the familiar particular music of a place opening itself to another day. Atlas came out of the storage room slowly, his morning gait deliberate, in the way of an old dog warming up his joints in the cold, and made his way to the center of the dining room. He stopped beneath the sign. He stood there for a moment, his head up, looking at nothing in particular with the unreadable steadiness of a dog who has made his assessments and found everything in order. Then he turned twice slowly in the careful way he turned now and lay down, settling himself with the unhurried care of a creature who has found after a long time of moving through the world in various conditions and various capacities the exact place he was looking for. He put his head on his paws. He closed his eyes. Outside, the morning was arriving over Millhaven, the way February mornings arrive in Vermont, slowly without warmth, but with a clarity that makes everything visible in its precise and actual form. The hills white, the bare trees exact against the pale sky, the light moving across the snow in the parking lot in the long flat lines of winter sun that carry more honesty than heat. The parking lot began to fill. First, the regular trucks, the Gulf War men, the older veterans, the two retired firefighters from the north end of town who had started coming in 6 weeks ago and had never offered a reason beyond the fact that they had heard about it and come. Then newer plates people who had driven from places Garrett could not see from where he stood. They moved across the parking lot toward the entrance in the cold morning air, their breath making small clouds, their steps purposeful in the way of people who have somewhere to be and know it. Bev arrived. She moved through the diner with the efficiency and calm of someone for whom this work was not a job, but a form of care, which is a distinction that matters enormously and that she had never needed explained to her. Sawyer was visible through the service window, moving through the kitchen with the economy of a young man learning something real, something that would stay with him past any particular morning. The door opened. Cold came in and then was replaced by warmth. The voices of people being seated, the sound of cups on saucers, the low ambient presence of a room filling with people who had chosen to be in it and understood the value of that choice. A man came to the counter and sat down, and Garrett poured coffee without being asked, and the man wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the surface of it and exhaled slowly the way people exhale when they have arrived somewhere and can finally put something down that they have been carrying since before they got in the car. "You the owner," the man said. "Yes," Garrett said. "Came from Portland. Drove up this morning." He looked around the room. "My son, he's been coming here. He called me last week." He stopped, cleared his throat. First time he'd called in, he shook his head slightly rather than finishing the sentence, which was its own complete statement. "Said I had to come see it for myself." Garrett looked at him. The man was in his mid-60s, the kind of face that had known difficulty and processed it without bitterness, the kind of hands that had worked for a long time at something physical and still carried the shape of that work. He was looking around the room the way a person looks at a place they already feel they know before they have understood why. "Is he here?" Garrett asked. The man looked toward the back of the room. In the corner booth, the booth that was always occupied now by some versions of the same person, young changed, Finding their way back from something, a young man sat with both hands around a cup and his eyes open, looking at the door, looking at his father. The older man raised his hand once and, not waving, not performing, just an acknowledgement clear and direct across the room. I see you. I'm here. I came. The young man in the corner booth looked at his father for a long moment. Something moved across his face, the specific expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for long enough that the sight of someone coming to carry it with them is almost too much to hold. Then he slid out of the booth and stood. The older man stood too and crossed the room to his son, and they stood together in the space between the counter and the corner booth, not speaking, not doing anything that would look significant from the outside, just two people occupying the same space after too long a time of occupying separate ones. Garrett moved to the far end of the counter and became very busy with something that did not need doing, giving the room its space to hold what it was holding. Atkinson opened one eye from his position beneath the sign. He looked at the two men standing together in the middle of the diner, the father and the son, in the space between where they had been and where they were going, and his tail moved once against the floor. A single, slow, deliberate movement. Then he put his head back on his paws and closed his eye. The morning continued. The coffee went around. More people came in, filling the booths and the counter with the particular sounds and silences of people who have found, at least for now, somewhere to be. Someone laughed at the far end of the counter, a real laugh, the kind that surprises the person making it. Outside, the February sun moved across the snow in the parking lot, and the bare maple tree cast its shadow across the painted spaces, and the road ran north and south through Millhaven, the way it always had, carrying people in both directions, some of them passing through, and some of them on certain mornings turning in. Garrett stood behind the counter and poured coffee and was where he was and did what he was doing without looking past it toward anything else. He had not fixed himself. He needed to be clear about that, at least to himself, in the ongoing private accounting of an honest man. He had not resolved the thing that had sent him moving through Vermont in November with a blow and 9 rejection letters and a silence around him that had weight and edges. The weight was still there, reconfigured, redistributed, shared now among the days and the work and the people, but there. He still woke some nights to the sound of a building coming down. He still felt at the edges of certain hours the absence of his unit, with a specificity that no civilian equivalent could quite match. He still had days when the distance between who he had been and who he was now felt like a country he was not sure he could fully cross. But he was not moving anymore. He was here in a specific place, doing specific work, surrounded by people who had found the place the same way he had not, because they were looking for it exactly, but because they had been moving in a direction, and the direction had led here, and here turned out to be what they needed without their having had a word for what they needed. He had not built this. Emmett had built this, had been building it in a sense since 1964, when he and Eleanor stood in front of a diner in summer light and squinted into the camera and did not yet know what the building would hold across the next 60 years, what it would cost and what it would give back and what it would become for the people who found it. And Donovan in his way. In the choice he had made on a day that Garrett would spend the rest of his life reckoning with, and the rest of his life being grateful for a choice made in a fraction of a second without hesitation, in the way of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was willing to do, had built it too. Had built it by being the kind of person who earned through the quality of his living the kind of grief that moves people toward action rather than stillness. Garrett looked at the wall, at the 3 photographs, at the carved letters above them, at the morning light laying itself across everything in the diner, the way morning light lays itself across rooms that have been inhabited long enough to hold warmth, not just the warmth of heating systems, but the warmth of accumulated human presence, of days upon days of people choosing to be in a particular place. Above the entrance, in the light that shifted through the hours and made the carved letters different at each different time of day, deeper in the morning, more luminous at noon, warmer and more shadowed as the afternoon came on, the sign said what it had always said, What Emmett Calloway had put into oak with his own hands in 1964 on a morning not unlike this one before he knew what it would mean. Before he knew what the building would hold and lose and hold again. Before he knew about Donovan, or about the debt, or about the stranger who would arrive in November 60 years later with a mound and a legal pad full of numbers that did not add up, and 12 years of becoming someone he had not yet learned how to be in the world beyond the one he had left. Before he knew about any of it, but knowing somehow that the words were right, that they would be right for whatever came. Kindness is the mission. And below it, without needing to be said, the rest of it, the dog with his gray muzzle on his paws beneath the sign, the young man learning the kitchen, the fathers and sons finding each other across rooms, the men with their hands wrapped around cups in the early light, carrying things that were lighter now than they had been when they walked through the door. The photographs on the wall holding the faces of the ones who had pointed the way here and would always point the way here as long as the photographs held the work continuing, the door opened, the coffee going around the wokum, and ordinary and irreplaceable work of being present for the people who arrive. Garrett Mercer stood behind the counter of a diner in a small town in Vermont and poured coffee and did his job. Outside, the world was very large and full of people moving in all directions, looking for something they could not always name. In here, they knew where to find it. The door was open. It would stay open. In memory of every door someone held open and every person who finally walked through.